Greetings. I'm Jeff Forster with Minnesota Lakes and Rivers, and I'd like to welcome you to the training for those people in a lake association that are interested in volunteering to run a lake steward program on the lake, their lake. I'm very excited here to have Karen Terry. She's a retired um, extension services educator, but still an outdoor educator, environmental science educator, who is working with us to provide the background information that we may need in order to take a look at shorelines and see what is happening there, see if they're set up in such a way to protect water quality on the lake that you love, which is really our goal here. So I'll turn it over to Karen, and thank you for doing this, Karen. And I'd like to let you know that Karen is available if you want to have her come out to your lake and do a shoreside presentation or training, COVID permitting. Her contact information will be up later, and so you can contact her and schedule that. And Karen, have fun. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for that introduction. I'm really excited to be doing this, and I'm really excited that there's so much interest in this program. So I just think that's fabulous. So I'll turn this off. Okay, so like Jeff said, we're going to talk about some of the tools that you would use as a volunteer in the Lake Steward program. We're going to start out really by talking about that in that high level, though. Why do we do this? So we live in Minnesota. Minnesota is known for our lakes. We all love our lakes and our rivers and all the water in the state. It means a lot to us. It means a lot to us as individuals, who we are as a state. Also, economically, it has a huge impact. So it's important that we keep it clean, keep our ecosystems healthy for the long haul. So that's what this is about. We're going to look at some of those big concepts, and you probably already know some of these, but when we think about being volunteers, it's important that you really understand this well enough to explain it to somebody else. So, what is community when we think about it in terms of nature? It's really that ecosystem, that everything in nature is connected to everything else. And so it's a system, right? An ecosystem that things are working in concert together. Then we'll also talk about, just briefly, cumulative effects and then biodiversity. So that community, that ecosystem, you can think about it in the same way we think about our human bodies as systems. If one part of the system isn't working right, if one part is unhealthy, it affects the other systems. Think about if you have a broken foot, then when you walk, it's difficult to walk. So then maybe you start having back pain because you're walking differently. So these things are connected. So one thing can lead to impacts in another area. It's the same with our water. So we live in watersheds. The water moves through the systems. If it's made to be unhealthy in one part, that just carries on through the rest of the system as that water moves downhill. So when I did my undergrad work, there was a joke, sort of a tongue-in-cheek, that if you did a report and you didn't mention Aldo Leopold, you were not going to get an A. It's because Aldo Leopold really was the forerunner on understanding how things are connected. We call him the father of conservation. He really did help us all understand so many years ago that we have to treat these things as systems. So I'll read this quote here just briefly. The land ethic simply enlarges the boundaries of the community to include soils, waters, plants, and animals, or collectively the land. So here's really the key part for what we're doing. In short, a land ethic changes the role of Homo sapiens from conqueror of the land community to plain member and citizen of it. It implies respect for his fellow members and also respect for the community as such. So the important part there is that people are part of this system. The nature isn't happening without us. Nature is happening with us. We're a part of that. You've probably all done this. Have you ever had an ice cream cone on a hot summer day and you're trying to eat it as fast as you can because it's melting and running down the sides? This is sort of an analogy for what happens in our watersheds or our water ecosystems, that what's happening upstream, what's happening anywhere within the watershed, within that system, it runs downhill. So if you live on a lake and there are if there's a river that comes through or springs that come in, that water comes from somewhere else. That water needs to be healthy when it comes, and what you do to it on your lake or in your part of the ecosystem, you have to protect it so that it's clean when it goes downstream somewhere else. Here's just two scenarios. On the left side, you see a healthy lake ecosystem, and on the right side, you see a eutrophic or an unhealthy lake ecosystem. What are kind of the parts of that when we think about how they are connected? On the left, in the healthy system, you have just the right nutrients, and more importantly, the right balance, the right ratio of nutrients. So you have some algae, there's some chlorophyll A, those are important in the right ratios, the right amounts, and they support the grazers, which are the teeny tiny little critters that you never see, but those are the things that feed the larger fish. So if you don't have the little grazers, you won't have the larger fish. And if you don't have the right nutrients, you won't have the grazers. So you have to have everything in the system working together. On the right side, you see where that is not happening. Too many nutrients or maybe an upset in the balance of those nutrients. Therefore, you get too much algae, too much chlorophyll A. The water might get murky and then the light doesn't get through and things just degrade. So it's important that we understand how we treat it as a system. Here's an example of one way that we are having an impact on how the water moves through our watersheds. So in that, we have three scenarios there, right? Number one, number two, number three. In that number one scenario, that's before development. So what happened to the water? The estimates are that about 50% of that water, when it rained, right? Rain is coming down. Where's the water go? 50% of it soaked into the ground. That recharges our groundwater aquifers, which is where a lot of us get our drinking water from. So we need those aquifers to recharge. So historically, 50% went into the ground, 10% of it ran off across the surface of the ground, and 40% of it went up, evaporated off, and was taken up by the plants and went back up into the atmosphere directly. In scenario number two, we have just a little bit of development. We have that little cabin there. So we've changed the vegetation. We've removed some vegetation. We've created that cabin, which is an impervious surface, meaning it's a hard surface. Nothing, no water is going to soak in through that space that the cabin is sitting on. So that water has to go somewhere else. So what happened to our numbers there? We still have quite a bit of the water. What are we at? 42% soaking into the ground and refilling our groundwater aquifers, but we've doubled the amount of runoff. So 20% of our water is now running off across the surface of the ground. Now, where does that go? It's going downhill, and while it's running downhill, it picks up pollutants with it. Some of that is soil, dirt, phosphorus, all sorts of things off of our vehicles, things that whatever gets on the ground, that water can pick it up and move it. And it goes downhill until it gets into a water body. So we see that we still have quite a bit of water evaporating off. Now we go to scenario number three. This is if we have several lake homes in a row, right? If we have lots of development going on around a lakeshore, what happens? And we can see that we've really decreased the amount of water that soaks into the ground. We're down to 35%. So less water going into the ground, and 30% of that water is running off. We've tripled the amount of runoff. That means we've tripled the amount of water that has the energy to lift up pollution and carry it into our lakes and rivers. So we've had an impact on these systems. Another way to look at that is in these three photos. On the left, we have undeveloped. In the middle, we have lightly developed. And on the right, we have heavily developed. So how does that impact if we look at runoff and nutrients and sediment. So sediment is soil or dirt running in. But what we see is that we have in that left-hand picture, those three little arrows, that's sort of our baseline, and they're color-coded. So the first one is runoff, the second one is phosphorus, and the third one is sediment. So in that second scenario, a little bit of development, the amount of sediment, because of that runoff, is really going up. And in that third scenario, we can see that it's a huge amount of change. Because there's nowhere for that water to soak in, it ends up running into the lake. So we want to stop that. The other thing is, you can see from those photos, if you have one lake home, it's not that big of a deal. But when we have a lot of lake homes, then it becomes this cumulative effect. It just compounds because there are so many. If I have my lake home and no one else is built around the lake, there's still lots of places for the water to run in. So the lake is not impacted a lot. But if we have lake homes all the way around, then it becomes this cumulative effect. So how we want to fix that really is we want to change the way the water moves so that we go back to the way it was before we developed it. We can do this. We don't have to tear down our houses and take out all the impervious surface. We need to find ways within the properties that we have now to slow the water down. How can we hold it back and not let it run off so fast into the lake? We want the water to soak in and be taken up by the plants. So there are ways to do this, and we're going to get into those. The other important concept is this one of biodiversity. So this is tied into that ecosystem. Within the ecosystem, we need all of the pieces, because if we don't have all of the pieces, things don't work well. So there's a fabulous researcher from Delaware named Doug Tallamy, and Doug does a great job of talking about how if you want chickadees, we all love chickadees, right? Who doesn't love a chickadee? And so we feed them in our feeders and we feed them sunflower seeds and they love them. But in the spring, when they have little babies in the nest, they're not feeding those babies sunflower seeds. They're feeding them caterpillars. So we need caterpillars to have chickadees. Where do the caterpillars come from? Well, they come from the moths and the butterflies that lay their eggs on usually very specific plants. So they have to have native plants. So we have to have the right native plants in the right places to have the butterflies and moths, to have the caterpillars, to have the chickadees. This is that biological diversity. If everything in your yard is one species, then you don't have a variety of caterpillars to feed the birds, to feed their babies. So that concept of biodiversity is really important. Here's sort of another way to look at that, and that is what we spray on our lawns, or what sometimes lake associations spray as a lake association effort to control mosquitoes, other insects. So what is a pesticide really? It's really a term that just means it's going to kill anything that we humans have decided is a pest. So we're trying to kill those mosquitoes. But in the process, we kill a lot of those good things too. So we have to think about these things as systems. So all your life, you've been told that these are bugs, but they're not, they're bird food. So we want to make sure that we have the right pieces in place so that we aren't spraying to kill the insects, and that we are also planting the right plants to support them. So here's just two examples of that. 96% of birds feed their young insects, so we have to have them. 80% of a hummingbird's diet is insects. We think of it as being the nectar that we put out because that's where we see them all the time. But research shows that they actually eat a lot of insects. So those insects are important parts of the biodiversity of our ecosystems. So the other piece of this is the neonicotinoids that gets applied to a lot of our plants, a lot of the seeds that we use. So when you buy plants, if you're buying natives, then they will not be treated with neonicotinoids. But this is a chemical that's applied to seeds, and in a lot of the bedding plants that we buy, even for our gardens, for our vegetable gardens and our flower gardens, if we're not careful, we might end up buying seeds that have been treated with this. It's systemic in the plants. So it comes out into the flowers of the plants, the pollinators come along and they get into that and it kills them or weakens them. So we want to make sure that we are not applying pesticides, including neonicotinoids, to our plants. Okay, so where are you in this picture? So you've probably come to this presentation because you are interested in being a volunteer with the Lake Steward program. So if you are considering that, think about where you are in the scheme of things. So you are preparing to go out and meet with landowners to talk to them about what they could do on their shoreline property to make a difference, to protect our ecosystems, to lead to cleaner water and healthier um, um, systems for a long time, for generations to come. So you might go out and meet with the landowner. You would walk the property with them. You would listen to understand what they need, how they use their property, and what they really want. You would compliment what they're doing right, and then look for ways that they could do some things different, make some changes and improvements, could provide resources and advice, and you can find a lot of those right there on the Minnesota Lakes and Rivers website. And the really important thing is you're not expected to be an expert in everything, and none of us are, right? So people might ask you a question and you don't know the answer to it. That's okay. No pressure there. We can say, we're going to work on this and find the answers together. So when you go out to a site and you're meeting with a landowner, say you're on their shoreline property, what are you going to look for? Those sorts of things that might impact our lake ecosystem. Where does the water run? On the particular property you're standing on, where does the water come off of the impervious surfaces, the roof of the house, the driveway, other outbuildings? Where's the water come? How does it find its way to the lake? Is there erosion going on? If there is, how are we going to handle that? Are there septic issues? Is the landowner maintaining their septic system the way that they should? How much vegetation is there? Is it native vegetation? Are there good, healthy trees there? And what about the impervious surfaces? Are there ways that we could maybe either eliminate some of those, or can we deflect the water somewhere else? So you're going to look at their property as its own little system and think about how it might be affecting the lake. So again, that means you're going to look for ways to slow that water down and hold it back on the landscape. Again, I'm going to give you some tools here in a minute on how to do that. We want the water to soak in, the plants to take it up. We want these properties to function the way they did before we built our lake properties on it. So we want to mimic the system that was there before. And we can do this. So a big part of it is just how do we intercept the runoff, the water coming overland? How do we intercept that runoff before it reaches the lake? We want to slow it down and stop it. We also should think about when we're on any given property, what is this, what's the lay of the land? And in all cases, we're going to have upland where it's dry, things are well above the water, and we're going to have aquatic where it's down in the water at the lake. And in some cases, not always, you have sort of a wet transition area that's sort of swampy, boggy. So if you have that area as well, then you think about it in terms of these different sections of the property, because the plants that we use there and the practices we use will be different. Also think about in this little graphic, you see off to the right, there's the house. You can barely see the house there, and it's 2 levels, and you see people standing on the decks on both levels. Think about and talk to your landowner about what's important to them. If it's important to them to see the lake, which probably is, so how can we help them see the lake without removing all of the trees, for instance? So think about what their line of sight is. I've talked to a lot of people over the years who it's very important that they can see their beach area so they can see where the kids or the grandkids are playing. Really important stuff. So this is about talking to your landowner and seeing what's important to them, and then how do we change the management of their property? How can we give them some advice that is better for the lake, but still helps them use their property the way they want to? The other important thing is the ordinary high water level. That's that OHWL. So this is an elevation set by the Department of Natural Resources. You have to know where this is, or the property owner has to know where this is, because it's Mandatory, if you're doing any work below that elevation, you need to work with the DNR on that. That's where the jurisdiction is. Any work above that, I would recommend talking to the county and see what the regulations are. They vary by county. So it's important to know if you're going to do any earth moving, any big plantings, just talk to the agencies and make sure that you're on the same page. Okay, so some practices that might apply when we're talking about, especially how we manage that water running into the lake. So we're going to look at a few of these as I go through the rest of the presentation. So rain gardens, rain barrels, shoreline restoration, grassed swales, pollinator gardens, and native plants. And you're going to hear me talking about native plants kind of sporadically as we go forward here. So let's start with a rain garden. What is a rain garden? It's really just a garden that is recessed into the ground so that it catches water and holds it. It's a little shallow basin, usually like 6 inches deep. So we situate these in places intentionally that will catch the water coming off of your property or off of the landowner's property. So we want to catch the water on a piece of the property that is high and dry, because that water has to soak into the soil after it quits raining. So these can be grasses and flowers. These can be shrubs. These can have rocks. They can be a lot of different looks to them, but the function is the same. So again, we're in this scenario, you can see the person coming out of the house and they're looking at their rain garden. The water is coming down, flowing into the rain garden, and then soaking into the ground. And everything that goes into that rain garden keeps it, in this scenario, from going into the storm drain on the street. But in our scenarios on lakefront, if it goes into that rain garden, we're keeping it out of the lake. So it gives it a chance to soak into the ground, which takes those pollutants out of it. So it cleans up the water before it gets into our groundwater. Here's sort of a cross section of what that looks like. So you can see the flowers and the grasses above ground there, and the arrows coming in are the water running into the rain garden. So you have a rain garden, it starts raining, the water flows over land, maybe from a downspout, maybe just off of your impervious surface over the grass, and it flows into the rain garden. It fills the rain garden up. So again, maybe 6 to 8 inches. It fills up. And then when it quits raining, think about what happens. You've got this little temporary pond of water. Within 24 hours, that water should soak into the ground, because we design these things to do this. The water soaks into the ground, some of it into the shallow groundwater, and deep groundwater recharges those aquifers. And some of that water evaporates off, gets taken up by the plants, and is part of that healthy system. So that's really as simple as rain gardens are. Rain gardens sort of get a bad name sometimes because people think they're going to contribute to our mosquito population, but they don't. And the reason they don't is because of the way they're designed, that the water soaks in quickly, 24, 48 hours at the max. So that is too short of a time for mosquitoes to lay eggs and hatch in it. So they do not increase our mosquito population. They're not the same thing as a water garden or a pond in your yard. That would be something more permanent. They're also not a solution for poorly drained areas. Again, when we situate these, we want to make sure that they are up on the upland part of the property. If we put them in an area that's already soggy after a rain, then there's nowhere for the water to soak in. So we want to make sure that they are up high on the property so that they have room for the water to infiltrate. This is just an example of a really nice, simple publication that's out there. It's on the resource page that Minnesota Lakes and Rivers has. So you could check out this guide. It goes step by step how you build these things. Also, the bluethumb.org is a great resource for how to do this. So here's just a little scenario. That oval circle, that's where we decided that the rain garden would go here, because you can see just barely the 2 arrows are the downspouts coming off of the garage and off of the house. So we looked at where the water runs across this property, thought about where we could intercept it. This is where it would go. Now, oftentimes there's places for more than one, because of course we're only catching the water from part of the roof of the garage and the house. So there are other downspouts coming off that we could maybe do rain gardens in other part of the property. Okay, so let's move on to shoreline buffers. We've heard a lot about buffers. It's probably not a new term to you. Sometimes we say shoreline restoration. Same sort of thing. It's about not having mowed lawn to the lake. So instead of mowing to the edge of the water, we create a buffer area and say, let's put in maybe 25-foot wide strip of native vegetation. Now, this doesn't have to be your whole property from side to side. You can pick and choose. Again, if you have that sandy beach area that you want to be able to see the kids on, you don't have to do that area. But if you can do part of your shoreline, it's a win for the lake. And how this works is the water, again, is coming, flowing across your property. It's coming off of the house, off of the driveway, flowing across that mowed lawn, and it goes pretty freely across there because there's nothing to slow it down. But if we plant this thicker, taller, deeper vegetation, it slows that water down when it gets into it. So then that water soaks into the ground, gets taken up by the plants, and it's less water, therefore less pollutants getting into the lake. Okay, just a little side to that is that these native plants really help hold our shoreline in place. So a lot of properties have issues with shoreline erosion. The native plants help hold that. So if the plants up on the shoreline as well as plants in the water, they help reduce the energy in the waves. So if you picture that wave coming in from the right there, see the sort of wave line there. As the waves hit that vegetation, the vegetation has roughness, right? In terms of physics, it has roughness, and it decreases the amount of energy that the water has. So if that wave has to go through the vegetation in the water, it breaks up all the energy. So by the time it gets to the shoreline, it doesn't have enough energy to do any damage. At the same time, the shoreline plants help bind that soil together and hold it in place. So if we have just mowed lawn there, we don't have enough of a root system to hold that. In this graphic, you can see that in the center, that sort of tan bar, this is the Kentucky bluegrass that most of us have on our lawns. So you can see that amount of vegetation above, very short, and the amount of roots below, very short. And so they don't have the capacity to hold the soil when there's energy like the wave action coming in. You see those other plants in this graphic, these are native plants that have very deep and or very dense roots that help hold that soil. So really, I keep saying native plants. What is a native plant? Well, a native plant is just plants that were here before Europeans arrived, right? There are plants that were here thousands of years before any development happened. And so they're the plants that are acclimated to our weather, right? They can take cold Minnesota winters, they can take extreme drought, they can take the heat of summer, whatever we throw at them, they can take that. These are not the same as cultivars. So, say black eyed Susans. We have native black eyed Susans, I think, statewide in Minnesota, very common plant. But there are also lots of cultivars that have been developed of black eyed Susans. So we don't want to plant those. If we're going to plant true native plants, we want to find seed that came from the long time ago native black eyed Susans. So we have native plant nurseries that help us do this. And we're also encouraging our local nurseries and plant suppliers to carry these seeds and plants that are true native plants, because this is also what our pollinators are looking for. So remember the biodiversity. We want to make sure that we have all of the pieces to create a healthy ecosystem. We want to make sure that those plants are truly the native plants, because our insects can tell the difference. If we offer them cultivars, they often don't have exactly what we need. So we want to find true native plants. And again, Minnesota Lakes and Rivers has resources about how to find those. I also don't want to overlook native trees. I tend to, because personally I live on the prairie, and so I forget about how beneficial trees are. But many of you live in more forested parts of the state. These trees are fabulous for doing just what I've talked about, for intercepting that water and holding it. So this tree in this graphic, you have a big rainstorm. a huge amount of water gets held in the leaves and the limbs and the trunk of this tree. So that water never even gets to the ground. And then water that does get to the ground, those roots help take it up. So having big and healthy native trees is important. Okay, so shoreline restoration, I look at this in terms of three strategies. So the first strategy would be edit. So if you have a property, like in the top left here, where you have a lot of trees, if the trees have not been removed, you're ahead of the game here. So work with your landowners. Remember that graphic I had with the line of sight? Work with your landowners to think about how do we preserve these trees, but still be able to cut alleyways. Think of it sort of like shooting lanes, maybe. You could think about how do we see from point A to point B without having to remove all of the trees. So we can just edit the trees that are already there. So you can see the second view there on the lower right is from the deck. We can look out and still see the lake, enjoy the lake, but it's all those trees also afford us some privacy when we're there on the deck too. So if we have trees, think about how we can preserve those. Strategy number 2 is no mow, let it grow. This works really well if you have that wet transition boggy area in between the lake and the upland dry part. So it would just be take a year off from mowing it. If you've been mowing down to the lake, stop mowing. Maybe lay out your line, say 20, 25 feet back from the edge of water toward the house. Take a swath of that and just stop mowing and see what comes. Because a lot of times there are native seeds there, native plants there that are struggling to get better established because we keep mowing them. Stop mowing, see what comes. It's important here to be able to identify what comes. So if you are not one who can identify those plants, maybe you need to find somebody who can. But when those plants start coming, find out what's in there. If they're native plants, then you're done. You've got it done. If not, is it a weed bed or a gold mine? If good plants come, you've got a gold mine and your work just got a lot easier. If it's a weed bed, then you go on to strategy 3. This just talks about some of those things that you have to be able to do. And that is, if you do the no-mow, you have to have some patience. You have to give it a year, maybe 2 years to be able to see what really comes and accept the fact that maybe it's not going to work. So you have to have that comfort level. You have to know what those plants are. And you have to just be able to watch it and sort of monitor it. So it's a good strategy if you have the right kind of situation. But you have to have patience and you have to have some expertise in identifying the plants. This is really important no matter what we're doing with native plants. If this is in rain gardens or shoreline buffers or just a native pollinator garden, which I really encourage thinking about, that native plants, if we plant from seed or even if we buy little plugs, little plants and plant them, they don't take off right away. And so you also have to have patience when you do a planting. So here's the adage that we use. First year they sleep, second year they creep, and the third year they leap. It takes some time to get these established, and you have to be okay with during that time knowing it's not going to look great, but a little bit of patience and it's going to turn around. Okay, so the strategy 3, if you have lawn down to the lake and your homeowner says, yes, I want a shoreline buffer here on all or part of my shoreline, how are we going to do that? We're going to do that by planting plants. So in this example, you can see that they have a lot of sand and the grass isn't doing very well. Sometimes we need to kill off the existing vegetation. Sometimes if it's struggling like this, we can plant right into it because there's not a lot of competition. Every site is different, so we have to be able to look at them and do some assessment. Here's just a closer up example on that top left where we've been mowing down to the lake and you see we've got some erosion problems because, again, that Kentucky bluegrass that's there has very short roots. So there's nothing to keep the erosion from taking that shoreline out. So the landowner said, yes, we want to do something about this. So on the top right there, you see the crew is out there doing the work. They're planting the plants into the shoreline. They've got some jute fabric down there to help hold it in place while the plants get established. Eventually that breaks down and there's no plastic in that. It's just a jute fabric. We're protecting that shoreline, and then a little bit farther back, we've got some mulch that we're planting into. And then that bottom picture is what this looked like after, I don't know if this was at 2 years or 3 years, but you can see those plants came in thick and strong. And think about from that top left photo to that bottom photo, how much different the water flowing across the land, how much it slows down because of that thick vegetation, and how much protection we have from the wave action coming in. So we've really slowed down pollutants getting into our lake with this restoration. Okay, the other thing to think about when you're talking to your property owners is that the bulrush or whatever the vegetation might be in the lake really slows that water down. So if they have vegetation in the lake, a lot of folks want to remove that. We need that vegetation. It's doing a great service in protecting our shorelines from waves, and so protecting from erosion. Also creates great habitat for those fish that we all like to see in the lake. So a lot of that whole food chain, right? Those little bitty grazers, small critters that live in there, and then the small fish, and then the big fish. We need all of this to make the system healthy. I also want to put in a plug for ice ridges. So a lot of lakes have ice push in the wintertime, and it pushes up the shoreline and pushes up this ice ridge. They're not always very attractive. And it seems like people love to fight with them every year. So if we could maybe change the way we see those, when I look at an ice ridge like this, I see an opportunity, because I think we could vegetate that, make it look more attractive, maybe level it out a little bit. But think about if the water is coming off of that property, the runoff flowing overland and picking up pollutants to get into the lake, this is a natural speed bump for that. So it keeps that water from getting into the lake. So I see this as a good thing in terms of stopping the runoff, something that we could, again, vegetate, maybe put some native plants on there, and find ways to work with it instead of always trying to work against it. One of the other ones I want to talk about briefly is grass swales. And we see these sometimes in urban areas where we have along roadsides, as in this picture, where we have low areas that we can just let those grow, stop mowing them, put some native plants in there, and let the water sit there. They're like long, linear rain gardens, right? Let the water sit there and soak in and take the pollutants out of it before it gets into our lakes and rivers. Here's an example of what that might look like on lakeshore property. So here, sort of from the lower right to the upper left, you can see this grassed area that has a lot of beautiful native plants in it. So it was a natural swale area that we were able to plant and use it as a place to store some water for a short term so it doesn't run right off into the lake. So grass swales, just long linear areas to hold water. The other thing, and I'll say I've had a lot of cases where I stand on a shoreline, oftentimes with a couple, and the two people are not in agreement about doing a shoreline restoration. One person says, "Hey, these are beautiful, we want it," and the other person says, "They look hideous. They just look like we're not taking care of our lawn because it's not mowed." So we have this disagreement. But what we know, the facts are very clear that shoreline buffers and these other methods to hold the water back are good ways to improve our water quality, our water clarity. And the studies that I have up on the screen here, these are several examples that show that that is directly tied to our property values. So even if someone isn't excited about the look of a shoreline garden or a rain garden, the facts are that we know it's what's right for the health of the lake, which then translates into what's right for our property values, which affects, of course, our tax base. So different people have different reasons for wanting to do this, but it all comes back to clean water. So what are you going to do in your area? I would really encourage you, if you're going to do a Lake Steward program, join the Lake Steward program on your lake, then I would really encourage you to form your group of volunteers and do some site visits in your area. There are probably some sites that we can find sites that have been restored. We could go and look at those. This is a good way to stand on a shoreline and talk about what's going on here. Where is the water coming from? So we can do this together. We can practice what we would talk to landowners about. We can share and learn from each other. So I'm available to do that sort of work. If you want to give me a call, I'd be happy to talk to you about that. So here's the thing, really. We know that water quality in a lot of our lakes is really holding steady, but we want to make sure that we hold it there, right? We don't want to see that water quality degrade. If we already have water quality degrading, we can turn that around too. But the thing is, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. And that single step, in this case, can be one lakefront property. So if we get one person on the lake to make a change, that has an impact. And remember, cumulative impacts, cumulative effects. If we get one property owner to do it, and then another, and then another, and then another, then we really start to see that change. So this is where we stop that domino effect. We stop that downward slide into unhealthy ecosystems, and we turn it around to where we have healthy ecosystems. We're all part of this system. People are part of nature. We can make a difference by what we do on our properties. You can make a difference by being a volunteer and going out and doing this with other people and helping them to manage their lawns better. So with that, I thank you very much for your attention. Here's my contact information. I would be very happy to talk to any of you further about this. So feel free to reach out to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. And I want to just add to this presentation sort of the steps that you can take if you are interested in, starting Lake Stewards on your lake. And it would begin with a visit to Minnesota Lakes and Rivers website. And I'm going to pull that up here. Let me see. If I can get it to do it. And here is our website. And it all begins with the people who are interested. Here are the steps for joining the program. So if you're interested, email me at jeff@mnlakesandrivers.org with the names of your Lake Steward volunteers, their contact information, phone number, email address, the name of the lake, and a high resolution copy of your Lake Association logo so that we can put it on the Lake Steward signs. Because this program, I'm hoping, and I think it will, and there's some evidence from Gull Lake that it will, help brand your organization, let people in the community know what you're doing. A lot of people out on the lakes don't live on the lakes. Build capacity for the Lake Association. And I think that as lake associations become healthier, lakes become healthier. And when you do that, I'll email you a boilerplate language that you can use for an email to your members. I'll email you the Lake Steward criteria that you can use when you do site visits. You have a certain level of knowledge now from Karen's great program. And I wanted to let you know that you can do what you can do. And if it starts to get into some sort of a, restoration, I will also email you a restoration resources list that has lists of organizations that you can contact, like Watershed District, Soil and Water Conservation District, professional shoreline restoration companies, Minnesota Native Landscapes, sources for native plants, a lot of information on there. So you can connect them with these resources if they have the interest in doing some sort of a restoration. Step 2 is watch the training videos if they haven't seen them. This is one of 2 training videos that are also posted on the website here. Copy and paste the Are You a Lake Steward online quiz above into an email and distribute to your members. And this is the link to the quiz. And we want to use the same quiz statewide so that we get some consistency and continuity. And people are taking the same quiz and meeting the same criteria, and we can then gauge the effectiveness of the program statewide. When someone on your lake responds to the quiz, it will generate an email, and I will forward this email to the volunteers the volunteers that you've given me. I think both Dorothy and now Kathy have urged us to try and go together to these site visits. The owner doesn't need to be there. They may be there. At the site visit, you'll measure the feet of shoreline. You'll take some pictures. You'll review the criteria. You'll decide, is this a Lake Steward property or not? But it's probably best if the owner is there to say, well, we're gonna meet together and we'll judge later. So it's not necessary to make that determination on the spot. And if one of your volunteers goes out and you've got 3 volunteers, it's probably better to have the 3 meet, review the pictures, look at the notes that were taken while the volunteers were on site, and then make the determination then. After you've judged that a property owner is a lake steward, that the property qualifies, you can contact me via email and ask me to order you a sign and send a check, and we'll pay the 50%, half of the first 100 Lake Steward signs that are awarded statewide. So please don't pre-order a bunch of signs and have them on hand, because that's signs that could be going to a different lake, an owner. We want to promote those that are actually Lake Stewards, and some lake associations have very small budgets, some have very large budgets, so it's best if we just do it as needed. First come, first serve, and then deliver the signs and document that delivery and the remarkable reaction of the Lake Stewards when they get their signs. According to Dorothy, they're totally excited and very happy and very proud. And you can do stories about their efforts for local media, for your newsletter, and then get that information to MLR, number of feet of shoreline that was restored or protected by Lake Steward. And this is going to be key moving forward, because as you're promoting this program at the local level, we're going to be promoting it at the state level. So knowing the number of feet, maybe miles that have been protected statewide through this program, trying to document any improvements that we've been able to make, is going to be key to building the momentum of the program and expanding it statewide. So with that, I will let you go. And I am grateful for your interest. And I hope to see you post-COVID out on the lake this summer at some time. I'm double vaxxed, so I should be pretty good to go. Thank you all. Be well and have a great summer.